So, hey, it's nice to be back with the Dutch cousins. I was there for the first one in 2005. They talked me into doing a bus tour in 2007. They talked me into do something every time. But it's nice. There's always new folks here. Last night I was in line and a lady said, "You know, you're the reason I'm here." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" She said, "I wanted to hear Vince Akers speak before he died." And Jack Taylor said when he met me at the last Dutch Cousins reunion, he was surprised I was young. He said, "I thought you were over 100. But I keep my age pretty good for 95. So, hey, folks, tomorrow is a very special day for us Dutch cousins. Tomorrow we rededicate our newly restored Old Mud Meeting House, that sacred building that has come to symbolize the Low Dutch in Kentucky. Tonight I'm going to remind us of how Old Mud came to be, and then we're going to get physical. We're going to be looking at its construction and its many restorations. We'll even go up into Old Mud's attic and under its floors. Let's start with Old Mud's origins. Can everybody see this all right? Good. And everyone can hear me. The first of our Low Dutch ancestors came to Kentucky in two large groups in the spring of 1780, 2 decades before the construction of Old Mud. Most of us Dutch cousins can probably find a signature or 2 or 3 among these 46 inhabitants of Kentucky settlement of the Low Dutch Reformed Church persuasion, who sent a petition in 1783 to the Continental Congress asking for a land grant. Our Low Dutch ancestors, like other pioneers risking life and limb to move west, had hopes for a better life for themselves and their families. But as a group, the Low Dutch also had a higher purpose, which led direct to the Old Mud Meeting House, which we'll be rededicating tomorrow afternoon. Their own words describe best that higher purpose. "Humbly showeth that in the spring of the year 1780, they came to Kentucky with their families and effects with a view and expectation to procure a tract of land to enable them to settle together in a body for the conveniency of civil society and propagating the gospel in their known language." Well, Congress was of no help, but they did find help from this man, Squire Boone, younger brother of Daniel Boone. In the mid-1780s, he sold them thousands of acres in what is now Shelby and Henry counties, Kentucky. The land was called the Low Dutch Tract. A bus tour of the Low Dutch Tract was part of our 2007 reunion. The tour ended up at the rebuilt 6-mile Low Dutch Meeting House in the heart of the tract. The tract was to be the home of their Low Dutch Reformed Church Society, described in the 1786 agreement organizing the Low Dutch Company, where they agreed that we will subscribe to and support the Low Dutch Reformed Church Society by giving a call and invitation to a regular instituted Low Dutch minister to associate in said church. And we will endeavor to have our children taught and instructed in the Low Dutch tongue so that they may read the Word of God and understand the gospel when preached unto them. But continued Indian attacks made their Low Dutch tract unsafe to settle until after Mad Anthony Wayne's victory over the Indians at Fallen Timbers in August 1794. That long delay left them divided between those that bought farms around Harrodsburg and those who finally did settle in the tract. Attempts to salvage their Low Dutch Reformed Church Society are vividly seen in documents from the 1790s, recently Russell Gassiro, archivist of the Reformed Church in America and speaker tomorrow at Old Mud's rededication. By 1794, there were 500 Low Dutch families in Kentucky. They had no public worship of their own excepting the lecturing of old Mr. Banna. And they considered themselves a people forsaken by the church to which they formerly belonged. They had sent a call for a minister who could preach in Dutch and English, but in August 1795, with upwards of 40 children to be baptized, they changed that plea to one for a speedy supply, either in Dutch or English. In November 1795, these 11 Kentucky patriarchs took the concerns direct to the Reverend John H. Livingston, saying, "We are, Reverend Sir, at present in a precarious situation in regard to church affairs. We are a numerous people who are destitute of divine service. We are hurt that there is no more done for us. How we have remained united is almost something supernatural." Now, a lot of you may see some of your ancestors among those patriarchs. Of course, Hendrik Banna tops the list. It was fortunate that the Kentucky patriarchs made their plea direct to this man. The Reverend John Henry Livingston was then professor of theology in New York City, which gave him the exclusive power to grant certification necessary to be ordained as a new minister. Livingston soon pressed a young divinity student from Hackensack, New Jersey, to accept the Kentucky mission. 22-year-old Peter LeBas was given a 2-month crash course and ordained July 21st, 1796. This is the Reverend Peter LeBas, some 60 years after his mission to the Kentucky frontier as a young, newly minted pastor. We know a lot about Peter LeBas from his 340-page memoir. He was, for instance, fluent in both English and Dutch, as the Kentucky settlers preferred. He set off from Kentucky in late 1796, visiting Conwego on his way. He was detained several weeks at Pittsburgh until the Ohio River was suitable for travel. Finally, in February 1797, he arrived in Kentucky. He may have been in Kentucky no more than 3 months, but in that time he organized the Low Dutch in Mercer County into the first Dutch Reformed church west of the Alleghenies. Something induced Peter LeBas to soon return east, and he was back in New York by June 1st. His memoir says, "It was his intention when he left Kentucky to spend a short time in New York and New Jersey in arrangement of his personal affairs, but then return to his distant field of labor. So confident was he in this expectation that when he started on his journey east, he left his books and other articles of property behind him. He never returned." His memoir does not explain why. We do, of course, know from the memoir that he went on to a long lifetime of distinguished service in the Reformed Dutch Church. One piece of property young Reverend Peter LeBas left behind in Kentucky was his pewter drinking mug. Scratched on the bottom is the date July 23rd, 1796, just 2 days after his ordination, suggesting the mug may have been a gift in honor of the new minister for use on his upcoming missionary trip to Kentucky. In any event, the congregation he left behind in Kentucky must have considered it sacred, for Peter LeBas' crude pewter mug became the first communion cup used in the Old Mud Meeting House. Reverend Peter LeBas' pewter cup, Old Mud's original communion cup, has become a sacred relic also to the Dutch cousins. We have used it in communion service at Old Mud since our 2009 reunion, and it will be used again tomorrow. After waiting for Peter LeBas' return his Kentucky congregation must have decided a church building, a meeting house as it was then called, would attract another minister, and in 1800 they began construction of mud meeting house. So if Old Mud was erected in 1800, as the sign says, you wouldn't know it from the deed for the 3-acre site. The deed is dated December 22nd, 1800, just days before the end of the year. However, this May 12th, 1800 document, the one over there by the door, shows that the site purchase had been struck much earlier. These articles of the Low Dutch Reformed Church raised the money by subscription to construct a house of worship to be built on a 3-acre lot of land purchased from David Adams. The highest contributors were to get the best pews. So construction probably began earlier in 1800 than the deed. One of those 1800 subscription papers turned up in Iowa a century ago and was published in Carrie Allen's 1916 Van Nuys Family History. The scarcity of money is obvious when we see the subscription pledges were for things such as second-rate cows, ewes, lambs, owed heifers, fat steers, and bushels of rye. It's highly doubtful that Old Mud could have been finished in 1800. Its construction may well have taken years. The 1900 historic sketch of Old Mud tells us that Henry Cummingore was appointed to go to New Jersey to solicit funds to complete Old Mud. The receipt he gave one New Jersey church for its $10 collection is dated October 22, 1804, possibly indicating construction was still going on at that date. Now, this would not at all be unusual, as we know from the history of one of Old Mud's daughter churches in Johnson County, Indiana. When the Greenwood Presbyterian Church began building their frame church in the fall of 1832, they got the frame completed, the roof on, and 20 feet of one end enclosed before winter set in. The rest of the building was finished little by little over a period of several years. It kind of sounds like restorations. Well, no wonder it took so long. It was no simple work. Let's look at the construction techniques. Old Mud is first and foremost a hewn timber frame building put together with interlocking mortise and tenon joints fastened together with wooden pegs. It's all made with hand tools. It was primitive, it was labor intensive, and it was time consuming. And it was a work of art. Timber framing is crude yet beautiful, even after aging 2 centuries. The Kentucky Low Dutch were described as a plain, honest, peaceable, sober, and industrious people remarkable for agriculture. So it should not surprise us that Old Mud is essentially a barn without the side aisles. As we heard Greg Huber this afternoon, the distinguishing feature of Dutch barns were the H-bents. These main structural components had a large horizontal beam or anchor beam connected to 2 vertical beams to form an H. Each H-bent was fitted together on the ground, then raised 90 degrees and connected to the other bents. Giant plates running the length of the building were then connected to the top of the H-bents to make the building rigid in the opposite direction. Angled braces were added for even more strength. Here again, as with the H-bents, Old Mud's builders followed their Dutch traditions with the braces in the upper corners. All fitted properly together, a timber frame building was incredibly strong, as our Old Mud meeting house, now in its 3rd century, certainly proves. The builders added an elegant touch to their simple timber frame rectangle, the great arched double door in the middle of the south wall. Another feature common to early meeting houses was a pair of high windows above the pulpit. On the 6 Mile meeting house in the Low Dutch tract, these high windows were on each gable end of the building. This was also the case with the Franklin, Indiana Presbyterian Church, as this crude sketch from their church history shows. Franklin was another daughter church of Old Mud in Johnson County, Indiana. High pulpits were the norm in the early meeting houses. They forced the congregation to look up at their pastor while he looked down on them. The windows over the pulpit illuminated his message, but were too high to distract his audience with any more than a view of the sky and maybe a glimpse of heaven. Overall, Old Mud is a large building, 34 feet wide, 46 feet long. The vertical wall posts are 14 feet tall. A giant center beam, or purlin, to support the rafter collar ties runs the length of the building 6 feet above the wall posts. The purlin is supported by 4 columns 22 feet tall, one on each end and 2 rising from the middle of the floor. The horizontal tie beams of the 4 H-bents also cross inside the building, running the other direction a couple feet below the tops of the wall posts. One architectural historian noted the complexity of the structural system with vertical and horizontal beams breaking up the volume must have created a rather confused interior. You can see the overhead clutter in this photo taken at our 2013 reunion. By contrast, the 6 Mile Meeting House, built a quarter of a century later than Old Mud in the Henry Shelby County Low Dutch Tract, dispensed with the traditional Dutch H-bent framing. As you can see, it has a much less cluttered look. This is also the Dutch Cousins 2013 reunion group. And by the way, it did not dispense with the purlin and the columns to hold the purlin and collar ties up. Do you ever wonder what lies above the purlin beam and vaulted ceiling at Old Mud? Probably no one, but us nuts. Peeking above the purlin beam, we can see there's something in the ceiling that should interest anyone who loves history: an attic. So let's get a ladder and go up in the attic and have a look. This is Bob Polsgrove, who was president of the Kentucky Trust for Historic Preservation, that helped us with the Old Mud. Completion of Old Mud's timber framing lies above the ceiling. The rafter system frames the attic. Because of the steep pitch of Old Mud's roof, even with the vaulted ceiling, there's room enough in the attic to stand up on the purlin beam. Timber framing in the attic is marvelous. There's 16 trusses composed of a rafter pair, collar ties setting across the purlin beam, and braces all pieced together with mortise, tendon, and pegs. The vaulted ceiling boards are nailed to the underside of the collar ties and the lower braces. Timber framing is truly a work of art compared to the 2x4 balloon framing that replaced it. By the way here, I don't know if I should add. By the way, the stains that you see there are from a few decades of raccoon droppings, which were cleaned out in 2008. When the timber framing was completed, very likely there was a topping out ceremony. You can see here the topping out when the 6 Mile Meeting House frame was reconstructed in 2004. A small sapling, usually an evergreen, like a cedar, is fastened to the peak of the last pair of rafters. The custom dates back thousands of years and serves as thanks to the trees for providing the building material. Old Mud would just not be Old Mud without its mud-infilled walls. Technically, the construction method is known as wattle and daub. Wattles being the sticks anchored to the timber frame, and daub being the mud and straw mixture pressed into the wattles and smoothed over to fill the wall space. Like topping out, wattle and daub also dates back thousands of years. It is not at all unique to Dutch buildings. It was quite common until better insulating materials became cheap and available. Whenever it was exposed, it was ordinarily covered with a lime coat or a stucco waterproofing, as you see here. Wattle and daub is actually fairly common in early Kentucky buildings, both English and Dutch. The countryside is dotted with old homes with mud daub walls hidden from our view by the weatherboarding. In Kentucky, the mud walls were almost always protected with siding. In this photo, a small section has been cut out of the weatherboarding of a house in the Low Dutch track, and it reveals the wattle and daub underneath. So wattle and daub certainly was not unique to old mud, but old mud took the construction technique to a whole new level. First, it's an unusually large building for wattle and daub. But what's really extraordinary is the amount of care and hard work that went into old mud's application of the technique. You can see it in this cross-section cutaway. Using hand tools, they cut and chiseled vertical channels into the sides of the timber posts to hold the wattles in place. You can see here the vertical channel cut into the sides of the post to hold the wattles. Cutting channels was apparently so difficult that only the two long sides of the building were done this way. Vertical slats were instead nailed to the post on the gable ends of old mud to hold the wattles in place. So was old mud originally weatherboarded to protect the wattle and daub from the elements? I'll have more to say about this as we go along, but for the moment we'll simply point out that the mother church at Conwego, Pennsylvania was weatherboarded. We know this from Reverend J.K. Dimris' 1884 history of that colony. He tells the story of the Conwego's church building being sold for cash to the local tavern keeper, who used the weatherboarding of their dear old house of worship as a road fence along his tavern property, conspicuously painted with gay colors. Sometime early in those first few years of the 19th century, they selected Reverend Thomas Kyle as the first pastor to serve at the Old Mud Meeting House. Corwin's Manual of the Reformed Church, as you can see here, lists him among the ministry of the church, albeit with a single cryptic line. He was never actually an ordained Reformed Dutch minister, but he served the congregation for well over a decade until 1816, when he defected to the Methodists. After Kyle left, the leaders of the mother church in the East advised the congregation to join the Presbyterians, which is the English language version of the Calvinist churches. Indeed, the church in the Henry Shelby County Low Dutch tract had gone Presbyterian even before 1800. So the Old Mud congregation turned to this man, the Reverend Thomas Cleland. He was already in charge of two nearby Presbyterian churches where Low Dutch were prominent members. These were the New Providence and Cane Run, soon to be Harrodsburg churches. In 1816, he agreed to preach one Sunday a month at Old Mud. Cleland also had memoirs published in 1859, which tell us the small church of the Dutch Reform paid me promptly $50 in semi-annual installments. With regard to Old Mud's construction, there's an interesting resolution in Thomas Cleland's New Providence church records, adopted Christmas Day 1815. Their old building was beyond repair, so they resolved to build a new one. And from here I'll quote, "made of brick, provided there can be such a plan laid and sufficient funds raised to accomplish it, otherwise a frame with mud walls, weatherboarded, painted, etc." The teens in the early 1820s were tough times for Old Mud. There was a mass exodus of the Low Dutch to Indiana, and there was a great split in the congregation when James Westerfield broke the lock off the door so the Haydenites could worship there. A compromise agreement dated May 20th, 1822, to share the use of Old Mud on alternate Sundays is noteworthy as the first time we see the building referred to as, called and known by the name Mud Meeting House. So after this, 20 years of peace and calm were ushered in at Old Mud when the Cumberland Presbyterians organized there in 1826. But that prosperity ended in 1847 when 86 members at Old Mud transferred to the new Bethel Cumberland Presbyterian Church they organized on the Turnpike, now US 68, between Harrodsburg and Perryville. Thus was born yet another daughter church of Old Mud, active yet today. This is from their webpage. 1849 looms large in the physical history of Old Mud. Once again, Old Mud was badly in need of repairs, but this was no once-a-generation repair job, nor was it a restoration. Rather, it was a massive remodeling. It dramatically changed the looks of Old Mud inside and out for the next 125 years. We have the minutes of meetings held to discuss the work. On the 28th of April, 1849, members of the Presbyterian Church and, quote, one of the members of the Reformed Church met. So 50 years later, at least one of the Kentucky Low Dutch claimed to still be a member of the Mother Church. This resolution detailed that what they wanted to do to transform Old Mud, that an effort will be made to raise money enough to weatherboard and paint the outside of the church, lower the windows, make and hang shutters, erect a suitable pulpit on the east end of the building, cut out 2 doors fronting the road and branch, one in the west end next to the graveyard, change the pews so as to form 2 aisles running east and west through the house, and lath and plaster overhead with 2 coats, and also repair the roof. The words in that resolution, weatherboard and paint the outside of the church, have been cited as evidence that Old Mud had gone nearly 50 years since its building without any weatherboarding. It's the only documentary evidence ever cited to support the idea that the mud walls were exposed to the elements. But the actual intent of the words of that resolution are clarified in the minutes of the follow-up meeting 2 weeks later, which say, it is further ordered that a subscription be made to raise money to recover the Mud Meeting House. The old weatherboard covering was simply worn out and needed replacement, as has happened so many times over the life of Old Mud. We don't even have to guess what the old weatherboarding may have looked like. We probably have a section of it. This piece of beaded edge siding was apparently used as scrap lumber in the roof work during the 1849 remodeling and was discovered during the 2008 restoration work. It clearly has the year 1848 carved on it, and thus it predates the remodeling work. And by the way, I'll refer to the remodeling as the 1849 remodeling because the plans were set in motion that year. In reality, the work probably stretched over several years, well into the 1850s. Regardless of weatherboarding, the 1849 remodeling dramatically changed Old Mud's exterior. Gone were those distinctive arched double doors on the south side and high windows on the north side, replaced by sets of 3 longer windows. The east-west orientation changed the previously solid gable ends. 2 new front doors were cut on the east gable end, which faced the road and creek. A back door and window were placed on the west gable end facing the graveyard. By the way, when the 1849 changes were reversed in the 1970s, a back door was, and still is, left on the west gable end to satisfy the stricter fire codes that then existed in 1800. Changes were equally dramatic inside the church. Gone was the high pulpit and the vaulted ceiling. This photo is a view from around 1915, taken from the back of the church looking toward the 1849 pulpit between the two new front doors on the east gable end. Gone also were the horizontal tie beams of the 4 internal H-vents, their structural role now replaced by the new lower ceiling structure. Notice also the 2 stovepipes running at angles up to the center chimney. And here's the opposite view from the pulpit looking back toward the west gable end. The light is shining into the middle window of the south wall where the great arched door had originally been located. In front of that window you can see one of the 2 stoves that heated Old Mud. Across the back end of the church you can see a balcony. The stairs up to the balcony are behind the back door. Here you can see a view out the back door toward the cemetery. Next to it in the corner was the narrow twisting stairway up to the balcony. That was what Old Mud looked like at the time of the centennial celebration in 1900. The highlight of that occasion was the historic sketch prepared by Dr. Henry A. Scomp, a distinguished professor of languages. His history of Old Mud was carefully researched, providing details that otherwise would have been lost forever. The historic sketch was published and kept in print by the Harrodsburg Herald for many years and is now available on the internet in the Kentucky Digital Library. It had been another generation since the extensive 1849-50s remodeling, and Old Mud must have again been showing its age. Accounts of the 1900 centennial celebration say that the building was repaired for future generations, painted inside and out, cleaned and carpeted. Indeed, other than broken window panes, Old Mud looks pretty good in this 1900s photo. This photo probably dates from the early 1920s, after regular worship had ceased at Old Mud and the building was once again starting to show some wear. The view is from the northeast corner toward Old Mud. Notice the missing foundation stones. This is another view from the early 1920s looking the opposite way, the southwest corner, and showing more missing foundation stones. There was no active congregation and Old Mud was starting to deteriorate from lack of use. By the late 1920s, Old Mud was fast going to pieces. Its deterioration was getting some help. The school children next door used Old Mud as their bad weather playhouse. Worse yet, they tore weatherboarding off the sides to use as kindling on cold days. The Harrodsburg Historical Society took notice and jumped into action. This headline story appeared in February 1928. Despite its very limited means, the Harrodsburg Historical Society voted to look into restoration of Old Mud. The Reformed Church in America, later in 1928, gave the Historical Society a title deed to the property. Ownership was a burden, accepted only after extended consideration. In 1928, we see here the first mention of an exciting goal, restoring Old Mud to its original 1800 appearance. It also is the first mention of the idea that the original appearance, quote, will mean the removal of weatherboarding. Unfortunately, plans for restoration in any form would soon fall prey to the Great Depression followed by World War II. It was all the Harrodsburg Historical Society could do to keep the vacant building somewhat stabilized in those years. In 1933, federal aid was secured for some of the most badly needed repairs. This view from the southwest is the first of 3 photos taken in February 1934 for the Historic American Buildings Survey. You can clearly see the foundation has been repaired. The ripped-off weatherboarding may not have been replaced at all through the 1930s or early 1940s in anticipation of restoring the building with its mud exposed. Here's the 1934 view from the northeast. The gray, wintry February day seems appropriate for Old Mud's deteriorated condition. Inside of Old Mud was certainly no less depressing. This awful sight is looking toward the back door and the balcony. The fallen lath and plaster overhead give us a look at the ceiling structure installed in the 1849-50s remodeling. The Historic American Buildings Survey photo and data files are easily found and searched online. The Old Mud file also contains very detailed measured drawings of the building. This is a blow-up of a small snapshot taken in June 1939. You can see not much had changed during the Depression years of the 1930s. Within months, World War II would begin in Europe, and restoration of Old Mud could wait a while longer. Now, folks, World War II seems like a good time for us to take a short break to stretch and wake up.